SVC Media.
Welcome to the iGaming Daily Podcast, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market.
In Sweden, the gambling industry has rallied behind government efforts to strengthen enforcement against the black market. 2026 is shaping up to be a decisive year as the Ministry of Finance prepares to broaden the scope of the Gambling Act, giving authorities greater powers to prosecute all forms of unlicensed gambling that target Swedish consumers. Yet behind the scenes, deep divisions are emerging. The trade body, the BOS, has rejected Svenska Spel's 18 proposals, urging ministers to ignore further restrictions and consumer protections championed by CEO Anna Johnson. So, is Swedish gambling still playing politics with policies and protections, even when everyone agrees that higher channelization rates in casinos should be the goal? Welcome back to iGaming Daily, supported by Optimove, the creator of positionless marketing and the #1 player engagement platform. I'm Charlie Horner, and today I'm joined by our editor-at-large, Ted Menmuir, and SBC News editor, Ted Orme-Claye. Ted, OC, how's things? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you, Charlie. Don't really know much to add. I had a decent weekend. And then back on the grind with iGaming Daily and SBC News.
Excellent. And Ted M, how's things?
Good. Just navigating my way through my new computer and setting up all notifications before I get killed by Anaya. So hopefully I'll get that. I'll get that sorted out today.
Yeah, just overcoming the technical hurdles. And talking about overcoming hurdles, there seems to be quite a few hurdles that we need to overcome in Sweden, because there seems to be a big disagreement about what's happening in Sweden in terms of channelization and protecting consumers. So we've seen a lot of activity. Ted OC, could you just take us through the new measures that seek to reshape the Gambling Act of 2018? Because we are sort of 6 years into this online market, and there seems to be a real will to change things up.
Yeah, so like you say, so the gambling in Sweden is governed by, like you said, the Gambling Act of 2018, which re-regulated the market, ushered in a new era of licensing in 2019 by, issuing new licenses, opening it up from beyond the monopoly of the Svenska Spel state-owned operator and allowing other companies to get in there, kind of similar to what we're starting to see happen in Finland with the foundations being laid there. But there's been criticisms of it, or maybe not sort of criticisms, but suggestions of how the act could be improved and how Sweden's overall regulatory picture could be improved ever since this market was launched in 2019, as you alluded to. And a lot of this revolves around channelization. This is something we've talked about on the podcast before, not that long ago, I don't think, where obviously one of the main motivations for the Swedish government back in 2018, 2019 was to encourage bettors to bet within the Swedish market. And it was clear that people weren't just betting with Svenska Spel, they were betting with offshore unlicensed firms. So the idea was, again, as we're kind of seeing in Finland right now, bring in some new license holders, regulate them, tax them, have them all within our market, and people will bet with them. The trouble is, especially when it comes to online casino, that hasn't been happening to the extent the government wants. Sports betting's been going all right. I think channelization's over 90%. Casinos well under that in kind of like the early to mid 80s range, and that's dragging down the overall figure. So what they want to do with the enhancements that have been proposed by the government to the Gambling Act is to create new criteria to try and close off the offshore unlicensed market even more. They want to replace what's called the directional criterion with our participant criterion. And what this means is that unlicensed firms that are unlicensed in Sweden, whose websites might be accessible by people in Sweden, will need to prove to the government that they are taking appropriate measures to ensure that their websites aren't being accessed and that they're not targeting customers. Obviously, for a long while, this would be considered like do you have things in the Swedish language? I think they want companies to go beyond that and really prove that they don't want to be accessed by Swedish people if they're not licensed there. So that's kind of the main thing there. Svenska Spel has now taken things a step forward with the 18 proposals that you referenced as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll jump right into the 18 proposals after the break and dissect, why there's this big disagreement between different stakeholders. One thing I'd like to add really is that having done quite a bit of work in the affiliate sector over the last couple of years, one of the big things that I've noticed is that the search engine results page for searches around unlicensed Swedish casino operators as a really interesting look at sort of different SEO strategies, and it really does show that there is quite a lot of offshore affiliates and operators targeting Swedish consumers. So I think everyone, Ted M, would be in agreement that stronger enforcement is needed to improve channelization. But, how do we reach that point? And do you think any efforts will actually work and come to fruition?
Okay, going off what Ted says, look, it's important to understand that Sweden has undertaken year-on-year kind of rewrites to its gambling laws, and there have been kind of tougher enforcements by the inspectorate. However, the kind of criteria for what is an illegal operator and also what is an illegal practice to send someone to an illegal operator needed to be defined. And I think that this is what these changes that were brought in by the Consumer Affairs Minister, Marcus Ikren, are meant to apply. So they're meant to just say, look, these are the interpretations, the legal definitions for what is an illegal operator, what are their boundaries, and how they engage with the consumer. Back then, it was actually quite loose. It was an interpretation of, are they offering a bonus in Swedish? Do they have a promotions page in Swedish? Do they accept the corona? And that wasn't a good enough case for the legal courts to actually prosecute in Sweden. I think what the government is trying to do, it sees a real kind of tax threat from, especially in online casinos, which have never got to nowhere near the 90% channelization rate. And they have to kind of clean up shop and say, look, this is the determination for how the customers have played. In terms of, does the law provide kind of a clean sweep on illegal gambling? Of course not. I think there's still a long, long way to go on that. It might improve the channelization rate of casino, but what we've seen here is, again, and I think this is what we're going to talk about down the line with BOS, it's what are the big issues with casinos, and it's just that the product is it's not as competitive as your unlicensed product, especially in terms of the player incentives, player rewards, and for bonuses. And also, the other problem that Sweden faces is that the high compliance to actually get your deposit into a casino, and it'll also kind of meeting these kind of one-on-one kind of deposit thresholds that are applied to each bonus, especially from a market that used to have kind of quick deposits for casinos, it has become a detrimental issue. I think that there's going to have to be a sit down on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're saying that the channelization rates in casino are much lower because of potentially a weaker product compared to the black market, and maybe some of those user experiences as well. So yeah, Ted, you said that there needs to be some sort of sit down on this, and BOS, the trade body, is calling for a formal consultation on channelization. Ted O.C., do you think the government is in a position to be able to grant that request?
Is it in a position to? Yes, I'd say so. I think when they're considering expansion of gambling legislation, obviously any sensible government would want to include stakeholders in that discussion, wouldn't they? I think they're definitely in the position to do that. Obviously, whether they take on board proposals or suggestions from any of these stakeholders is a different matter, especially when we've got some conflicting opinions starting to fly around within Sweden's gambling space with, two different opinions from Svenska Spel and BOS. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think they'd be sensible to listen to people's concerns and considerations about this, particularly from the companies that are providing the product that is competing with the black market, as Ted said. you think that the Swedish licensed firms would be the ones who'd say, like, here's our direct experience of it, here's the problems we're coming up against, here's how we think it could be changed, and then the government could weigh that up against what Svenska Spel is saying, what their legislative advisors are saying, anything like that. But yeah, I think they'd certainly be in a position to, and I think it'd be wise to have a consultation with BOS and other stakeholders. But yeah, whether they will take things on board, who knows?
Yeah, we can never really predict what governments are going to be doing, especially in these sort of turbulent times as well. Just quickly, Ted M, before we go to a break, we've sort of alluded to the fact that 2026 is set to be a decisive year for Sweden and its gambling policy. Could you just outline why that is? Why is it 2026 that's supposed to be such a big year for the sector?
Okay. So there's a caveat in there. The Riksdag will vote on those proposals from the Ikron report, especially on the redeterminations of gambling engagements with Swedish consumers. The other reason why is that from 2026, there's going to be a reapplication of enforcement and penalties given by the inspectorate, which are going to have a much greater platform to go out in terms of its powers that it can enforce on not only on licenses, but kind of relevant businesses that are connected with gambling, to ensure that they are not processing payments or processing any kind of services that will enable the illegal gambling sector. So that's good. And then finally, it's whether Sweden goes forth and it does a consultation or an inquiry into the channelization of gambling, and whether the licensors can sit down and actually kind of put forward measures that they believe will aid channelization. And it's important to understand what channelization means, because it doesn't mean the players, it means the income. And I think one thing that is we're yet to see across on the European markets is, where is that income? Is that just coming? Is that 20% being generated by players that just feel they've now been left out of the market? It could be VIPs. It could be players of a different segment who like playing certain types of games, or who just feel that the compliance is just kind of too overwhelming. Yeah,
absolutely. Ted, let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and talk about the civil war that's going on in Swedish gambling.
SBC Leaders connects the gambling industry's top-tier operators and associations to share the best ideas, collaborate on solving the biggest issues, and push innovation throughout the betting and gaming industry. If you're an operator and want to join the discussion, visit sbcleaders.com for more information.
Welcome back to iGaming Daily. Before the break, we mentioned that there's certainly some disagreements going on in the Swedish gambling sector, and it's all around these 18 proposals or protections that Svenska Spel, the state lottery operator, has set out. Ted OC, I guess you don't have to list all 18 protections, but could you give us an overview about what these are and what aims they're trying to achieve?
So, like, there's quite a few of them, as you said, but yeah, these 18 protections are based on three main concerns. Firstly is the low channelization rate below 90% that we mentioned earlier. The Swedish government's had this target of 90% for many years. They're struggling with it, especially casino. Everyone wants that to be sorted out. So that's one of them. Second off is the continuing growth of unlicensed companies, as we also talked about in the first half. And then thirdly, there's the rising gambling harm rates. I think they're particularly concerned about the impacts it might be having on young people and women in particular. And obviously all of these are connected, like the rise of unlicensed operators is associated with the channelization, and people, as various studies have shown across various markets, more likely to come up against gambling related harm when betting with offshore, where things are not, where standards, player protection standards and so on aren't the same as in the regulated system. So that's one of that's what they want to combat. The measures that they're suggesting are, by and large, kind of just more restrictions on certain types of products, really, particularly casino, and new measures to safeguard customers, new measures particularly aimed at young people, improvements in gambling harm treatment. There's also some stuff to do with risk classifications and things like that, which I thought was kind of interesting, given that you and me were talking about the over in the UK, how the Gambling Commission's brought in these new risk profiles last week from its latest survey. So yeah, quite wide-ranging. Oh, another one actually I remembered is the ban on they're recommending a complete ban on bonuses, I believe, which is also quite a significant one. So yeah, so I think the thing is, though, it's obviously getting criticism because people are looking at it like, is this just going to be impacting the regulated sector more rather than the unlicensed one? I think that's probably the main criticism of that, despite their shared objectives. Yeah, let's dive into these differences, because the BOS, the BOS, the trade body haven't reacted very well to this. So Ted M, where are these differences, and do we have to look at, Svenska Spel being the state operator versus BOS being the licensed bodies, and is that the foundation of these differences? Oh yeah, I mean, there's always been a big rift there, and especially since the launch of the market in 2018, of what is the determination for Svenska Spel. And every election cycle in Sweden, this comes up for a debate. And we've already seen that this is a company that had to give up its casino properties last year. Okay, they were loss-making. And I think the other thing that we didn't mention in part one is that there's a huge interplay in the background where the Ministry of Finance has added kind of new credit laws to Sweden. And they will apply a ban on, and this is not just for gaming in itself. They are pretty much tougher restrictions on credit card loans and on how credit is spent within Swedish online payment systems. So, for example, in gambling, if you are an operator, you can no longer process from April 2026. You will no longer be able to process any transaction that has originated from or that has money generated from sources of funds that are deemed to be credit. That is a huge technical application to pull through on any market. I don't know whether the licensees view how that is possible. So that is kind of playing very much on leadership, in the background of leadership. But it's fair to say that I don't think that BOS and Svenska Spel will ever have a great relationship. It's interesting that you say that they will never have a great relationship, but don't they, to some extent, have the same goals? They want to be able to serve Swedish consumers. They want to protect them. They want to keep them within the regulated licensed sector. So where is that common ground, and how are these differences going to be resolved, essentially? Ted, I'll say, do you want to take this one first? Oh, that's a tough one. Obviously, yeah, like you say, they both have a shared goal and a shared objective, in the sense that they both want to see the offshore unlicensed sector diminish. They want to see it gain less reach and visibility with Swedes. They want to see less Swedes gambling with it and more with the regulated sector. I think obviously the difference of opinion comes back to, like what Ted said, there's been a rift between these two since the market was launched anyway. And ultimately they are competitors. Like Svenska Spel had to give up its monopoly over not over lottery, so they run the lottery, but over betting and gaming when the multi-license system was brought in 2019. And there does seem to be a bit of an undercurrent in BOS's op-ed in response to the Svenska Spel CEO's op-ed, where they're basically saying these measures almost seem like they would be at the detriment of the licensed market for the benefit of Svenska Spel, and indirectly benefiting the offshore market by putting more restrictions on casino products that are already, as Ted said earlier, struggling to compete with the offshore market. So yeah, they both have a shared objective, but they also have a competitive streak and a different attitude to how the Swedish market should be structured, I guess, to an extent. How can this be resolved? That's the tricky one here. I don't know. I've not got negotiating skills for that. I think you're talking to kind of two entrenched camps here,
And BOS's position is quite firm that it believes that the Swedish market will only liberalise once Svenska Spel leaves, any trace of being in the online market, which they've asked for previous governments. Svenska Spel, if you go to Sweden, has a huge, huge estate. And it has a huge kind of position of privilege in terms of when you see its betting shops, its position in kiosks. Yeah, it's got the highest kind of advertising presence of any gambling enterprise. And to a certain extent, it is right for BOS to kind of question that. I don't think there's much trust between both parties. So,
do we see that this is just going to continue essentially, and they're going to keep arguing via newspaper op-eds? Because as a great little quirk that I've noticed about this story is that they're just arguing via newspaper op-eds. But more seriously, does this matter for a wider European context? Because we know that Finland is adopting a similar framework come next year. There are other jurisdictions across Europe which have similar frameworks. So how should we be viewing this in a more sort of macro-European lens? Who'd like to take this one just before we wrap up?
I reckon I can probably say something on it. Like you say, Finland, I mean, I mentioned this earlier as well, Finland is going to be the next big example of a market transition that we're going to see, one that is very similar to what Sweden went through in 2019, where they're going to move away from the monopoly currently held by Vickhaus to a multi-licensed one with, I think, more of a focus on multi-licensed sports betting licenses and things like that. So again, that could potentially see some issues with casino continuing to struggle to compete potentially. There's also some questions raised about marketing and affiliation and things like that, I think, as the Finnish legislation develops. And I think another interesting comparison we can make there is we talked earlier, I think Ted mentioned about the importance of like the wording and things like that in this legislation. I think the Finnish legislation was just sent back from one committee to another because the first committee said there are certain things in here that are too vague and too open to interpretation. And when we're dealing with something as significant as this from both like a business standpoint and a societal impact standpoint, its role in the economy and so on, we need to have all the terms nailed down. So I think that there's definitely some interesting comparisons to be made between Finland and Sweden in that regard.
I'll just end by saying, look, Sweden needs a shot in the arm, because if you actually look at the reports of the PLCs, take it Kindred or Betsson, and that there are, and the others in that market, and even Svenska Spel themselves, like the online gaming market is not growing. And is it either kind of a very strict channelization that is needed, right? Or this new kind of regime for the inspectorate to go out and, really penalize the black market and black market encroachment. It's yet to be seen. But for me, it's going to have to be kind of, analyzing the numbers from 2026 onwards. It's going to be kind of the acid test for that market.
A stark warning to end the show there, Ted. But we'll leave all of the coverage to this story and more in the show notes, so you can take a look at Ted's full report on this. But in the meantime, Ted, thank you very much for joining me today and sharing your expertise on the Swedish market. And thank you to the audience for tuning in to another episode of iGaming Daily. Please make sure to tune in tomorrow for another episode and to hear all the latest developments from the global gambling sector.
Thank you for listening to today's iGaming Daily podcast, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News network or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.